Yes, welcome. This is A RAP CRITIC. I'm your boy Malik16, founder and creator of Plates and Crates. And unfortunately, no, this episode will not give you all the education you need for the summer. Please go to school. This is just a tidbit of information brought to you by the fam here at Plates and Crates and theraproller.com, which I hope you have all, or at least half of you, or some of you have gone and checked in by now, checked out, signed up, become members of, so you can cast your votes and rankings on all these albums, factor into this aggregate score so we can put to rest the conversations once and for all about how classic these so-called classic hip-hop albums are. And by being a member, you also are privy to earn points, so you can go buy prizes, or if your average is close enough to the overall average, win prizes like the dope luxury gift box from our prize partner T is the Name, or our dope I Used to Love Her scale t-shirts, or maybe even in the future this Mic Drop t-shirt, which is associated with my debut children's book, I Grabbed the Mic. If you know, you know. If not, hit me up. You can message me on here on theraproller.com. Also, you can cast your votes and leave your rankings right here in the comments while you take a moment to like and subscribe. All right, this is a very special episode because just like we did at the end of last year in the fall season where we started reviewing nothing but albums that came out in the year 1996 that were turning 25 last year, we're doing the same thing with a little earlier start and acknowledging albums turning 25 this year, meaning they came out in 1997. So you will see those sprinkled all throughout this year, and I couldn't think of a better album to set that movement off with than the one that we're talking about, which is turning 25 years old on this day. And of course, we're talking about none other than the classic Wu-Tang Forever by the legendary group Wu-Tang Clan. We're going back to back. We just finished reviewing the double album by Big Crit, and we did one side, the Big Crit side. We're keeping that tradition going. Y'all know how we do on this channel when it's double albums. We just pick one. It was a hard choice, but I went with this two only because this contains the two most talked about songs on this entire album. I noticed that in the beginnings of these videos of part ones, I start talking a lot. So I'm not going to take any more time. We're jumping right into it. Category 1, the product, the album itself. A little background on the album. This was the sophomore release by Wu-Tang Clan as a collective group. Since their first debut Into the 36 Chambers in 1993, they had about 5 solo releases leading up to this, 5 or 6. Yeah, let's jump into it. We're talking about the first dimension 1, quality of production. And so it's almost impossible, see what I did there, to talk about the legendary Wu-Tang Clan without talking about the RZA and the production of the RZA, Ruler Zigzag Zigala, Prince Rakeem, the Abbott, whatever you're gonna call him, Bobby Digital. He wasn't using that moniker yet. Bobby Still was still kind of the name circulating from the Gambino era. But what this album did was kind of introduce a concept that was mind-blowing to some and disheartening to others. This idea that a core Wu-Tang Clan project could feature production outside of RZA. And so it wasn't technically outside production that you're gonna hear here. RZA does handle 90% of the album's production, but you are gonna get other in-house Wu-Tang Clan producers that you might have already heard leading up to this year. So you have True Master, who contributes to beats like MGM and Heaters, and you had heard him kind of debut on Ghostface's Iron Man album, which was the last solo release before this album came out. So he wasn't entirely like a new jack. Same thing with Fourth Disciple, who, you know, some may refer to him as RZA's protege, but this same year, the album from another Wu-Tang family group, Killer Army, Silent Weapons for Quiet Wars, debuted, and he was responsible for almost 95% of that production there. So that was his proving ground, and I think he more than proved himself to the point where you'll find on Wu-Tang Forever, Fourth Disciple's contributions arguably capture more of the expected RZA sound on this album than a lot of the RZA production, because whereas Fourth Disciple was still kind of playing in that dreary territory, using dark strings and eerie sounds and haunting melodies that, you know, the RZA made famous. RZA was clearly in more like, I got new toys and I'm playing with more polished instrumentation, more polished sound. So we take a song like the lead single Triumph. For as big as a song that was, that does not sound like traditional RZA production at that point, especially if you are a fan who was expecting some of that same Into the 36 Chambers sound, which had this dirty, murky grit feeling and relied a lot on simplicity. In the simplistic beats, you get the essence of RZA production. So on songs like Duck Season and, you know, Projects and even Deadly Melody is where you're getting the closest to that old RZA feel, because you're certainly not getting it on tracks like Hell's Windstaff. RZA's going into new territory where you're hearing things that you wouldn't have heard before on a prior Wu-Tang release, and it's really hard not to compare the two when we're talking about it, because so much time had passed in between, and that's really the main reference point. Because if you're comparing it to the individual Wu-Tang releases, each of those had its own feel. Now, you know, it would be expected, and this is kind of the challenge for rap groups who become phenoms. You'll see Bone Thugs went through this same thing because they came out at a similar time as Wu-Tang and got similar notoriety for being rappers who made melodious songs over these eerie, haunting beats. And so the expectation for the follow-up album is that you want these artists to grow because you love them so much, but you don't want them to deviate too far from the sound that you love them for. And so you're hearing RZA experiment with more pop, rock, and just big studio sounds. The horns on Triumph don't sound like anything used on any Wu-Tang release prior to that. It sounded commercial, it sounded eventful, it sounded like stadium music, which is what it went on to be. But, you know, if you were expecting another Protect Your Neck from that, not quite. You're gonna get more of the traditional RZA production on disc 1, ironically. So beats like Maria is where you get some of that old traditional dusty, murky, muffled production sound there with the eeriness. But here, he's going for either simplistic or experimental. So a song like Deadly Melody, where it's just about 7 notes that almost sound like you can hear RZA playing each one with his finger, right? Ding, 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 with maybe like some bass line rumbling underneath it. It's stripped down because the emphasis is on each of the rappers performing. Projects is more of those sounds that you heard on the contemporary Wu-Tang releases leading up to it. But if you're going for that old feel, you know, the contribution by Fourth Disciple, like The City, it has that dark, drawn out violin that's giving the beat a sad tone with this boom bap clap drum that's just coming and adding this knock and a dark bass line. Same thing with Impossible, where he's sampling from a Beethoven song and manages to make that sample even darker by having this drum line and bass line that sounds like a build up for the drama. So it's boom, 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 boom with these clunky drums, and he's emphasizing all of the chords. And you know, you could argue that RZA does a similar thing on Little Ghetto Boy, but there's something about those synthesizers and those strings there that sound more manufactured and don't kind of evoke the same sadness that Impossible in The City does, notwithstanding what the rappers do over it, right? And even with True Master's contribution, MGM sounds more dramatic and cinematic because of the way those strings are used and drawn out. And in Heaters, that Gladys Knight and the Pip sample is just brilliant, where he looped the vocal sample from the song and where he looped the most dramatic string section and put it together with these hard drums. So the most expected Wu-Tang sounds come from the non-RZA production. Again, you're getting some of that RZA feeling on Duck Season projects, but even Duck Season is experimental because those synths sound more video game-ish, which is more territory you heard RZA go into right before this album on the Iron Man album with songs like Assassination Day. But Duck Season, it just sounds like a lazy synthesizer, a lazy game of Pong. And so that is the scope of your production, and not to mention real experimental stuff like Black Shampoo or real basic stuff like the Old Dirty solo. So that is your production, and that's something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to dimension 2, the cohesiveness of the sonic bed. So 3 contributing producers. I failed to mention that on disc 1, Inspect the Deck also has a production credit on the song Visions, but since we're talking about disc 2, we'll focus on these 3, True Master, Fourth Disciple, and RZA, and how do they work together? So it's a symbiotic relationship, because if you were looking for that old Wu-Tang sound, then it does get provided here. If you're disappointed that it's not by RZA, you know, what can you do? But just know that, you know, RZA is still at the helm of how this music was arranged and brought together, and what went on the album and what didn't. So, you know, he's still living vicariously through the other producers. Depending on what direction you wanted to hear the Wu-Tang production go in, a beat like Hell's Wind Staff would be a welcome change. It's still fast-paced, it still allows the rappers to do what they do. Even Black Shampoo, if you were ready for that experimental sounding cool. Now, how well does it all go together is the question. So while you're getting some of those I want my 36 chambers feel needs satiated, there's the idea that unlike disc 1, or less than disc 1, this album does not sound as much like an album when you get to this side as it sounds like a compilation. You gotta imagine that RZA's at the helm of all of this and is making decisions on what goes where. This is a theory. It really sounded like disc 1, and I'm more comfortable comparing the album within album, right? I can compare disc 2 to disc 1 more comfortably because it's the same album. It really sounded like there was an effort on disc 1 to reintroduce the members strategically. So you get the first song, Reunited, which gives you these more dynamic pairings than you've ever heard before, right? This is a song with the Cousins and Method Man. You've never heard this pairing together. It's RZA, Jizza, Old Dirty, and Method Man on a song. Following that, you get Inspect the Deck, Master Killer, and Capadonna on a song you've never heard. 2 different types of energy too. Reunited is a slower song. For Heaven's Sake, it's this up-tempo beast of a song. It's what you were waiting for. It feels like, oh snap, it's about to go down. Then you forgot you got Raekwon and Ghostface just when you needed them. What would have rounded that out? The only, I think, slip up there is that was a prime opportunity to also reestablish You God, and you would have had all 10 members, because now Capadonna's in the fold, introduced right in the beginning, 3 songs. But what happens, they squeeze Meth on that song again, and he does his thing on it, but it would have just been, it seemed like the intent was to reintroduce these members in new ways, you know, in separate sets, and then regroup later. So you don't hear You Got on the first side until like song number 6 or 7, which is Severe Punishment, which doesn't do anything to help the reputation that the members of Wu, the core 9, who had not released albums by that point yet, had already been relegated to. So, you know, that's You God, that's Inspect the Deck, that's Master Killer, and if you're counting Capadonna, those 4 members and RZA himself, who had not released any solo endeavors, and this was kind of their only chances to be heard in mass, right? Multiple times. And what happens a lot on this disc 2 is that it starts to feel in the middle like the Raekwon, Ghostface, Method Man, and RZA show featuring everyone else. And that does something to take away from the cohesiveness on top of things that don't bridge the songs together. So Impossible has this like clunky start right after Triumph, but it works because Triumph ends dramatically and abruptly, and Impossible is supposed to be this other eventful song that takes you on an emotional journey. So Raekwon is speaking at the end of Impossible, and it's supposed to set you up for Little Ghetto Boys. It's just that break after Capadonna's verse that just makes it kind of drag on, and you just kind of forget where you were going there. The beat didn't have any changes to, sustain it or to support it going on that long. And so with it feeling like it revolved around those four members on the second side, maybe because they were picking up the slack, or traditionally we heard Wu-Tang songs happen by whoever said, I want to get on it, whoever wrote their verse the fastest, whoever was in the studio. It just created this imbalance. And it's only emphasized by the fact that Old Dirty only appears on 3 songs on this side. One of them is his talking part on Triumph. Cool, fair enough. That's equal to his appearance on disc 1, right? He only does the hook on As High as Wu-Tang Get, and he's only featured on Reunited and Maria for verses. Cool, fair enough. But then it gets more egregious when you realize that Master Killer is only on 3 songs here, same way. And 2 of those are just really small parts of a verse. He comes in for parts of Deadly Melody and has like 2 bars on Bells, and you're hearing him on Triumph, and that's it. Same thing with Jizza. It's even worse when we get to Jizza, because Jizza has 1 line on Deadly Melody. He speaks in the background for the intro where Riz is just talking to like biting MCs and producers into the industry, and he has maybe one of the most uninspired verses on Triumph besides Master Killer. Their verses are kind of where you get the lull in that song. And so that's 3 core members that kind of get benched on this second half. And then the use of Inspector Deck is sparing, but this album was a huge step for Inspector Deck. If you're expecting a Clan album, for it to start feeling like it revolves around these 4 members, there's some lack of cohesion that happens there. And there's more efforts to have talking in between the songs than on this one. This one, the songs just kind of like go back to back into each other. There's no need for all this stuff. They try to do the Wu-Tang thing with the Kung Fu movie skits, but it's like it's like too little too late. There's only like a Kung Fu skit on like 1 song here, where, again, on early Wu-Tang releases, it's what you expected. You expected these Kung Fu samples here, there, beginning, middle, and end, and you're not getting that. So those are some of the things that might knock the cohesiveness. The skits where there's like snaps on somebody's like attire, and then the skit where it's like Deck is going into the corner store and there's gunfire, and Shaheem is calling Raekwon and saying, I'm studying the 120, call me back at the God hour. Those things don't help save it with the cohesiveness. They just kind of exist. So something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to dimension 3. The question of, is there an overall mood and tone? So going to everything that I just mentioned in dimension 2, you factor that in and ask yourself, what is the mood and the tone here? It starts off with RZA speaking, Jizza saying some words in the background, saying, look, I'm flattered that you want to be like me, but get your own style, right? This is a RZA message. He's speaking on behalf of Wu-Tang, same way at the end, Raekwon is speaking on behalf of the Wu-Tang, but it sounds very personalized. It sounds more like what they want to say, and it doesn't sound very, I don't know how deep or purposeful those messages are. It reminds me of Prodigy's skit on the Mobb Deep album, where he's just kind of saying what he wants to say, And it's like, hey, the views of so-and-so may not be the views of the whole clan. That's kind of like the disclaimer that you would want put there. Even though the clan sticks together, they stand by each other, right? But there's nothing in those intros and outros that bind the songs together. And so it's unclear what the mood and tone here is, because this side in particular takes you through so many movements and motions. By the time you get to the ending song where you got Black Shampoo doing kind of this sexy, supposed to be for the ladies track, and then Takitha having a solo, ending the album. The final song on the album features no rap, no Wu-Tang Clan members, only Takitha singing about how long of a wait it's been for fans for the second album. And it's dreary and it's slow and melancholy, and it makes you wonder if it started with Triumph and ends with Second Coming, what was in between that shot a point across. I guess the overriding point and feeling here, if I had to narrow it down to anything, it's you can't F with us and we're back. But there's a kind of forced feeling here. It's cool to hear Ghost and Ray on a track together, because it's kind of expected on every Wu-Tang release. That's kind of a theme, right? You want to hear Ghost and Ray together to recapture the magic that they captured on Can It Be All So Simple and Only Built for Cuban Links. But this is definitely, the song that they're on together is definitely representative of where Wu-Tang was at in life. The MGM. No more sad tales of street life and regret. We're flexing now. We're front row at the fight. Blowing kisses to Shantae Moore, right? Very glitzy beat despite the drawn out True Master strings. The rest of the instrumentation makes it sound pretty glitzy. And if you ever needed that representation of change in the Wu-Tang Clan, there you go. So if any of you can pinpoint a mood or tone of this album, especially this disc, please leave it in the comments, put it in your rankings. Duck Season echoes the sentiment of this whole side. This whole side, you can't F with us, especially if you leave it up to Raekwon and RZA. They are very aggressively confrontational about the Wu-Tang place in the industry. Something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to Dimension 4. The song distinction versus the repetition of words and sounds. How much repetition of words and sounds are on here? How diverse are the songs? We've established that the songs are very diverse. No two songs sound the same here. The only thing is that maybe you'll get tempo similarities. It might not have been the best move to put Black Shampoo and Second Coming next to each other, but we talk often about the idea that you can tell what was on the artist's minds by where they sequence those last songs. And if the songs felt like they were the wind down, then it makes sense. And repetition, production wise, nothing else sounds like Bells of War, nothing else sounds like Projects. Projects and Deadly Melody might have the closest similarity with this back and forth bass and drum melody that kind of lets main bell sounds or main key sounds do the work for it. But nothing else sounds like Impossible, nothing else sounds like Triumph, so not a lot of repetition of production here. Now, as far as words and themes, absolutely. I mentioned when we were talking about the mood and tone that the sentiment throughout is you can't F with the Wu-Tang. So there's a lot of aggressive flag bearing here. Like, you know, again, if you can boil it down to Duck Season, a lot of what Raekwon says on that song is the same thing that Raekwon says on Heaters, on Hell's Wind Staff, and on Triumph. So, you know, not broaching new territory and not really saying new things in different ways or the same things in new ways. Method Man is trying the most to introduce newness. Inspector Deck is always coming with like a crispness, and Ghostface is always approaching his verses from these different angles, because, you know, we'll talk about all of this more when we talk about the rap performance on the album. But yeah, Besides, of course, the obvious branding, you're hearing a lot of Wu, you're hearing a lot of members, aliases thrown around, you're hearing a lot of designer names thrown around by Ray and Ghost, and a lot of God Body 5% of language. So in that vein of purposeful repetition, you're getting that. But as far as lazy redundancy, not so much with words, very much so with themes. Something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to dimension 5. The question of how much content is there compared to how many songs. All in all, there's about 13 songs on this side. If you don't count the intro and the outro, there's about 13 core songs. And out of all these songs, where it gets topical are on the obvious Impossible, and then Second Coming, which may not be so obvious if you're not paying attention to what Takita is saying, if you didn't read the lyrics. The City and Little Ghetto Boys purport to be about something, but they kind of lose their footing somewhere along the song. MGM is topical because it's telling this tale, and the rest is really amorphous and just kind of free-flowing. And that's the scope of this album. So content-wise, if we're looking at it in a ratio aspect, you can say there's a fair amount of songs out of 13. If there's like 5 songs that are topical, that's something. Is it balance? Something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. How much content compared to how many songs? All right, dimension 6, features. No, my friend, this is still the mid-90s where every family, clique, clan, posse, and crew were self-contained. They didn't need outside guests. It's a very territorial era. We're still in the middle of East Coast, West Coast fallout, and everybody's kind of staying to their own. And it's Wu-Tang. The ego is high. If the whole premise is you can't F with the Wu-Tang, why would we have guests? That was another unheard concept that didn't get broken until 2000s. The W, which for a lot of people felt like, again, too little too late. Now you have guests, outsiders on your albums, and people don't care as much. A Nas feature on the Wu-Tang album in '97 would have meant way much more than it did in 2000, just like a Busta Rhymes feature in '97 would have held a lot more weight. Shoot, even a Rakim feature, I think there were rumors that Rakim was going to be featured on this album. The possibilities were endless, but Wu-Tang was very much into, we are the Wu-Tang, right? So no features unless you consider Capadonna and Street Life to be features. Street Life is a Wu-Tang affiliate, mostly associated with Method Man. It always feels like Method Man kind of elbows him in, like, yo, this my man, let's put him in. And a lot of people consider Capadonna the 10th member of the Wu. And if you read Wu-Tang material, like You God's autobiography, you'll hear that Capadonna should have been in the core 9. Honestly, he was one of the first who would have been considered for the group had he not been incarcerated at the time. So other than that, Takita, if you consider her a feature, that's also something, but no big outside features at all on this album. Something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats if you think that's a weakness or a strong point. That takes us, speaking of weakness, to dimension 7, the question of, does the weakest song or do the weakest songs weigh the album down? Just mentioned this, that last track, Second Coming, not being a rap song and being all sung by Takita over this very, very melancholy, basic production too, because we're hearing RZA play with polished instruments with unpolished sounds, very Casio. And Takita, it doesn't help that she's hitting some of those notes very off-key. And so, fans of that song, cool. People who are like, what is this? This was totally out of left field, unexpected, and not the way to end an album that's by your favorite phenom rap group of all time in 1997. They might consider that the weakest. Black Shampoo, another stripped down, very basic sounding, kind of clunky, really last minute unfinished production is what both of those tracks sound like. that might take away. You Got is just kind of like naming smell good stuff. He's just kind of naming poetic sounding, fragrant things. And it doesn't make it any better that at the end Method Man comes in, it makes it sound like it was all a joke by like saying something disrespectful to women. So I mean, if you were not signed up for that, especially with the skit in the beginning with Takita and the PR terrorist Don Pacino from Killer Army, you know, talking all sexy to each other like they're in the shower. It's a big deviation after hearing Hell's Windstaff and Heaters, which are like two hardcore Wu crew joints. Some might have welcomed that deviation because, as You Got mentions in that book, he purposely wanted to make that song because he felt like it was a sausage fest and there was no material on there to appeal to the women. And this is still the era where a lot of rappers thought if you just put some cliche woman sounding stuff on a track, women would, you know, throw their panties off. I don't know if this worked or not, but if you consider that a weak song, that's one. Little Ghetto Boys, some people may feel it's not inspired because it's just kind of this synth track over the Donny Hathaway sample. Some people might feel like it's brilliant. Projects, this is all super subjective. Whatever you consider to be the weakest track on here, leave it in the comments. I'd love to know. Something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. 5 is if the weakest songs didn't do anything to tarnish this. 1 is if they sunk the value of this particular disc all the way down. Takes us to the next dimension. 8, Mass Appeal. So, biggest hip hop group of all time at this point, arguably only matched maybe by Bone Thugs and Harmony, who returned in the same year with Art of War. The mass appeal factor is already there. They've already established themselves. They got nothing to prove. They need no introduction. But this is the Diddy Bad Boy year. This is the era. Biggie had just passed away, and this is the year that gave us so much of that Diddy and Bad Boy dynamic that it spawned the infamous moment where in the Grammys the following year, the beginning of the next year, Old Dirty comes on stage after they announced that Diddy and Bad Boy had won for No Way Out and made that famous statement, "I bought this nice suit and it costed me a lot of money because I thought my group was gonna win. Diddy is cool, but Wu-Tang is for the children." Classic moment that'll forever go down in all music history, but especially hip hop music history, Wu-Tang history. That's how big the divide was. So this is an album, highly anticipated album that went quadruple platinum, but got little to no radio presence. I remember when the rollout for this album started happening, I heard on the mix shows, Funkmaster Flex would play the beginning of For Heaven's Sake. And For Heaven's Sake sounded like the craziest thing. It sounded like everything every Wu fan ever wanted. And it had us thinking that the rest of the album was gonna sound like that. We've dissected and saw that the rest of the album did not sound like that song and didn't capture that essence and feeling. But, you know, that's the extent of it. The video play kept happening. Triumph goes down to become one of the most expensive videos ever made for music history. Of course, those numbers kept getting toppled and toppled for the next 4 years before budgets started disappearing. So it's like Busta Rhymes had topped that with the Janet Jackson. They just kept having video budget wars. But Wu-Tang Clan spending over $1 million on the Triumph video where they're turning into killer bees and partying with Quincy Jones and taking over Manhattan. Ridiculous. And so that, you know, alone set the stage, but that song wasn't getting played on, at least not New York radio. So it's not made any better that this was also the year to add to that Bad Boy divide and Bad Boy Wu-Tang tension. Because remember, we're still talking about on some of the solo releases, Raekwon and Ghostface pointing fingers at Biggie as being a biter and kind of drawing their line in the sand that they're not rocking with Biggie and Bad Boy. And the stories where Raekwon and Ghost said, you know, they made attempts to go apologize right before he passed and go patch it up and clear things up, because they really didn't want the beef to be anything serious or go that far, where they felt it had gone on too long. But Wu-Tang fans were very distinct fans from Bad Boy fans, and where Bad Boy was taking mainstream hip hop. Remember, all the years prior to 1997, Wu-Tang was mainstream radio hip hop. They were playing anything that the Wu-Tang released. The guard had changed, and Wu-Tang and Wu-Tang fans were beginning to feel it. So Hot 97 being the biggest hip hop station in the country at the time, but particularly New York, they have Wu-Tang come off of tour with, I believe they were on tour with Rage Against the Machine, and the legendary story of them not wanting, them being divided on leaving the tour, and Hot 97 kind of giving them this coercive language of, if you don't do this tour, we won't play your songs on the radio, which sounds crazy to me, but not unbelievable given radio politics. And so they leave the tour. They don't take a break from the tour. They completely, abruptly abandon their tour, which is taking them all over the world, a world tour with one of the biggest rock groups of the 90s, right? To go do this one-day event. And they're told that they go on last after Bad Boy, and this is only a few months after Biggie passed. And so the whole Bad Boy family is doing their thing, and then you come with this mood change from glitzy, dancey music to this dreary, raucous music that, you know, the tide had changed, and Wu-Tang wasn't getting the reaction they wanted. So in the middle of the show, Ghostface says, F Hot 97, because they felt sabotaged by the mixed reactions they were getting. Their fans were cheering them on, but the predominant Bad Boy fans were not vibing with it. And so that one move by Ghostface gets them blackballed and banned from Hot 97 airplay for 10 years. Not just the year 1997, 10 years. That means all the subsequent releases. When RZA finally does release his solo, Inspector Deck finally releases his solo, and then the follow-up Wu-Tang albums, crickets. Crickets. Maybe mixed show play, but again, this album didn't have a lot of legs on the mixed shows either. The videos is where they thrive. By the time It's Yours came out, you're getting this feel, but this didn't even have 3 official videos for this album. It just kind of came and went. If you were a fan, if you were swept up in the hype of the Wu-Tang album coming out, you'd get it. And not for lack of effort. Like I said, RZA was experimenting with more pop and rock sounds and commercial feels. Triumph had an eventful stadium feel. It's Yours was definitely intended for some kind of call and response, radio or club play. I don't know if the club scene was knocking songs like It's Yours at that point, but it did what it was supposed to do. Songs that could have gotten used, I still think most of those live on side one, like Older Gods and As High as Wu-Tang Get. The ODB song, the solo here on this side, maybe could have thrived in Wu-Tang's heyday as a chanty, kind of Brooklyn Zoo-ish kind of song. But again, hip-hop had gotten so formulaic and glitzy in 97 that those old methods just weren't gonna work. So there's not a single song on the second side that I can think of that would have had radio life, because those songs don't even have hooks. Bells of War has no hook. Duck Season has no hook. Hell's Windstaff has no hook. Projects is the only song that has a hook on it, really, besides The City and Little Ghetto Boys and Impossible. And out of that mix of songs I just named, not a lot of radio life there. Projects probably would have got cut off for Ghostface's verse, because Ghostface's verse is so raunchy. They would have gave it the treatment that Corrupt got on Explosive when it came time for radio play. This also represents Wu-Tang beginning to have a more worldly view. You know, they've done plenty of world tours by this point, and they're no longer just speaking to New York, they're speaking to the world, their world audience. I mean, thinking internationally. You get iconic moments even in the liner notes, like GZA's classic F a shout out. So, not a very radio-minded or club-minded album, but not for lack of RZA trying to reach a wider audience with these broader sounds in his sonic bed. But something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. How much mass appeal did this album have? Takes us to Dimension 9. Everyone's favorite, the 3 I's. Impact, innovation, influence. All right, we talked about the impact. This was probably the most highly anticipated album of '97 besides Biggie's Life After Death. And somewhere in the midst of this East Coast, West Coast, BS and the death of rap's biggest artist at the time came this kind of bittersweet reception to this album. And so even though it went quadruple platinum, the impact was a little stifled by those outside elements affecting hip hop as a whole. It doesn't help that the radio play kind of made it have less of the tidal wave effect and more of just regular waves. And as far as innovation, of course you got RZA doing things on here like what he did on For Heaven's Sake and Scary Hours, what Fourth Disciple did, that would go on and set the stage for how soul sampling happened in the 2000s. But since we're talking about this too, the innovation here, at least for Wu-Tang production, is introducing new ways. Now we can do poppy sounds. Now we can have these softer tracks and sample rock with random sometimes. Yeah, you're gonna see innovation mostly in what they did visually. This is another album that incorporated the use of the enhanced CD. So they were capitalizing on the fact that home PCs were becoming more commonplace. We mentioned this in the Mobb Deep episode where we were talking about Hell on Earth, how this new version of the CDs had these extra features when you put them in your computer, where you could be more interactive and feel like you're getting more of a piece of the group, of the artists. And they had a virtual tour of the digital Wu Mansion with this enhanced CD. Also, what was done with the Triumph video is still talked about to this day, just as far as money that was spent, the way the video was put together, the special effects, and just how it all felt very momentous. And let's talk about how this album set the stage, if we're talking about innovation and impact, set the stage perfectly to make Inspect the Deck a household name. So where the rest of the album didn't do much for the careers of those who didn't have solo releases, besides just give them more songs and verses than they had on the first album, what it did for Deck is people knew who Inspect the Deck was and they didn't have to pick him from the pack of the rest. That verse setting off Triumph, I bomb atomically, Socrates' philosophies and hypotheses, has been etched in the hip-hop history, the concrete of hip-hop history, where even the youngest and oldest casual hip-hop listener knows those introductory words. So that is a wave that was a monsoon effect for at least one member of the clan and helped immensely. It definitely influenced Drake, because Drake referenced a couple little lines and songs from this album in particular on his third album. We know a whole generation was raised on the hype of Wu-Tang, but specifically the raps in production on this album, it's something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats, how influential, impactful, and innovative they all were. Takes us to the final dimension, Dimension 10, the overall timelessness and uniqueness of this album. Now, clearly, Wu-Tang just did not sound like and does not sound like anyone else in the game. They've always stood out, so the uniqueness factor remains. Even if they weren't being unique unto themselves with this project, they still stood out from the industry and were still in their own lane. And nothing they released this year sounded like anything else released that year that wasn't already Wu-Tang affiliated. So the question becomes, how timeless is this? Can you play these tracks and still feel like they're crisp and would have life here? I don't think there are any beats on here that sound dated just because RZA was never, in any trend box. They weren't using the newest trendy sound. They were just using sounds that were new to them. Now, because some of these beats are super experimental and some of them are basic and seem less inspired, that may give the effect of some things sounding like they have a time cap on them. But I suggest you all revisit this album without your Wu-Tang fandom hat on, without your W's up, without the nostalgia, and really ask yourself, how timeless was this album? And that's something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. And that concludes our Category 1 analysis and review of Disc 2 of the classic album Wu-Tang Forever by the legendary Wu-Tang Clan. I hope you join us for our discussion and dissection of Category 2 for this album, which is the rap performance on it. And until then, I cannot mean this any more than I ever have meant it before, but on this episode especially, F a rap critic. They talk about it while I live it. Word to meth.